More sports and less Levine. The weekend winners edition continues, and we continue to take a look at the Browns getting ready for the season opener against the Titans next weekend. Let's welcome back in Jake Burns, our Browns expert. Jake, talked a lot about the offensive line. Let's switch the focus to the defense. Last week when we talked, you mentioned the defensive line might be the biggest upgrade. They went out and dominated the line of scrimmage. How good can this defensive line be?
Yeah, I think there's a chance they could just be like one of the NFL's best. I think it's kind of crazy to think about, the Browns having position groups that are among the elite in the NFL, more than one. And I certainly think that there's justifiable reasons for this being one of them. When you look at the two defensive ends and trying to slow those guys down between Myles and Olivier, and then you got to deal with Sheldon Richardson, who's really powerful player on the inside. When your fourth best guy is Larry Ogunjobi, who can do his own things. If either one of those two interior players draw one-on-one matchups, it's very skilled. It's just a very skilled group. And then you have really solid depth in Chris Smith and Anthony Zettel on the outside. Chad Thomas might make the roster as sort of another guy on the outside. The emergence of, as I said earlier, of Devereaux Lawrence, he can be an impact interior player with, Trevon Coley sort of in a more fit role for him as a backup interior defensive lineman, then you have just a really solid group. It should be a group that leads the Browns. And, if they play like we saw week 3 there, like you said, Dave, if they play with that sort of passion and they're able to get home on quarterbacks and the secondary can just hold their own for a little while, it could be a very dangerous group.
Well, when you think about the elite defenses, if you have an elite defensive line, it hides a lot of blemishes because there's just no time to do anything. And that's kind of what this group could potentially be.
Yeah, I mean, you got to have one or the other, either a secondary who can blanket. And there's a lot of people who rage about that debate of which is more important, pass rush or pass coverage. I think as long as one of the two of those you have are, elite in some form or fashion, you can make up for the other. And I don't even think the Browns need to have a defensive line that makes up for the corners and safeties, because I think those guys can hold their own. So you get a good mix of, the defensive line is elite, and then you have guys who can cover as well. Maybe not the best coverage group in the NFL, but they don't need to be. If they can just be solid, average secondary players and, take away some immediate options and allow those guys up front to work, then, like you said, it's dangerous for quarterbacks because you just know from both edges you're going to have pressure, and then, I could possibly be having pressure up the middle. And if you're bringing pressure from all four areas, and John Dorsey's been very adamant about that, saying we want 4 guys who can get after the quarterback. It's not necessarily a run-stopping league anymore. The teams who win the most games, have a tendency to allow more rushing yards per attempt. It's just a matter of, how you capitalize on third downs and how you get after the quarterback. And I think the Browns really emphasize getting guys up front who we say 4 guys who can play the quarterback and on the way to the quarterback can stop the run too when needed.
Do you like the scheme fit, what Steve Wilks is trying to do with this defense as opposed to what the Browns were trying to do last year? It's pretty dramatic how different they're playing defense.
Yeah, I certainly think that Greg Williams is a fan of bringing pressure. It's no secret he's always been that way, but he's a little more passive in the secondary. I don't think Steve Wilks is going to be as passive in the secondary in terms of off coverage, giving quarterbacks some easy answers. I think his goal is to say, we're going to use 11 aggressive players and we're going to put better athletes on the field. So instead of 3 linebackers all the time, we're going to have an extra defensive back, whether it's a safety or a slot corner, who can run with some of these better athletes. So the emphasis is, we want to have as many pass coverage guys on the second level, including Joe Schobert, who's a really effective pass coverage linebacker, as many of those guys on the field as possible, as many of our quality athletes on the field as possible too. Take a linebacker out, bring in a guy who can do a little bit of both, be a hybrid player, and can provide some of those traits that we need and play better in space. I think the Browns will cover the run game better laterally, sideline to sideline. I think there'll be a better group there this year, and the personnel's a little better too. So keep that in mind when you look at some of these guys, or I guess the collective defense's production, because you're getting year 3 of Denzel Ward, and Demarius Randall's now in year 2 of playing a safety role, and then you've improved obviously immensely bringing in Olivier and Sheldon to go along with year 3 now of Myles, and I should say this year 2 of Denzel Ward, but yeah, year 3 of Myles and Larry Ogunjobi. So this is a group that's matured at the right time. The pace has gotten better in terms of where these guys are in their career, and the scheme is going to match up with some drastic changes. And I think Freddie's been very vocal about, you guys aren't talking about the defense enough, and I think that this group, it just has a shot to be really, really good.
Who is somebody that, might be flying a little bit under the radar that you might expect to pop come regular season on that defensive side of the ball?
I do think Eric Murray is going to be a really vital part of what they do. He's number 22, in case you haven't noticed. He's going to be a guy. He was the return for the trade of Emmanuel Ogbah to Kansas City, so they really liked his game, where he can fit in. He can play deep safety and 2 safety looks. He can play tight end coverage, walk down and play over a tight end. He can play over the slot. He's done a little bit of everything. I don't think he's going to be an all-pro player or a Pro Bowl player, but I do think he's going to be a vital part of anchoring, run game support, setting the edge, keeping things turned inside to their linebackers and defensive linemen. But I think he'll cover well enough, too. I think him and Jermaine Whitehead are going to be a couple of players who are going to play that role predominantly, and I think they're both going to be a little better than what people think. You're going to hear those names a lot. I think the Browns will be creative with how they use them. And those guys have the potential, if they play above their playing level in the past, which I think they could. It's just preseason optimism. Everybody across the league has it. But if those guys play above what they've been able to play in their career, it could take this defense to take it to a whole nother level.
If there's an area of concern, if there was a group that you say, boy, if these guys do what they're capable of, not play over their head, but do what they're capable of, this defense could be really good. So is there a key area that you see with this defense to make it what it could potentially be?
Yeah. I think we've had this conversation a couple times. It's linebackers to me. I think they're coming back. Joe Schober missed time with injury last year. I think he had a groin or a hamstring and missed some games. And, Christian Kirksey was shut down for the year after his hamstring issue. If those guys are healthy and Christian Kirksey sort of returns to his level of play from a couple years before, and then you allow Joe Schober to play the middle, play less pass coverage dependent stuff, and play the run game a little bit more. It could help his missed tackle issue. But yeah, and Joe Schober's had a really strong preseason. So if those two can return to form, make plays across the field, I think they have to be more impactful run game defenders. If they can do those things and then carry over their athleticism into the pass coverage situations when they need to, Al Holcomb, who's their linebackers coach, who was the defensive coordinator under Steve Wilks last year in Arizona, I think those guys will coach them up right. I think they'll get better coaching than they have in the past few years, and I just have high hopes for them. I think if those guys, play to what they're capable, the ceiling that we've seen from both of them, they're both Pro Bowl level players. If they're able to do that in this scheme that might be a little more friendly to them, it's just going to make the group that much better. But again, if they're not, and Joe Schober's struggling in the run game, and Christian Kirksey continues to sort of get lost in the wash and not read things as well as he did the past few years as an off-ball linebacker, if he continues to sort of struggle being where he needs to be, then they're not going to stop many people in terms of being able to play run game sound defense, and it'll get annoying, and teams will be sort of gashing them. And keep in mind, week 1, a really good running back comes into Cleveland. They start out, think about their first 3 games. They have Derrick Henry, an extremely good physical, huge running back who runs well for Tennessee, and then you mix in Dion Lewis, their wide receiver back. Then the next week you get Le'Veon Bell, who I know he missed a full year, but he was one of the game's best running backs in terms of being a dual threat player. And then Todd Gurley comes in week 3. So it's like you got to be ready to go right off the bat. And then, week 5 creeps around, and that's Baltimore. Or I think maybe Baltimore's week 4. But that's obviously a run game system that you never really see. So the Browns' run defense is going to be put to the test early. I don't think they have to be otherworldly against the run, but they can't allow teams to run the ball for 5 or 6 yards of carry and jump out to a lead on them. And all of a sudden they're fighting against that sort of, how do we figure out how to stop the run? And then when teams get the run game going, play action's brutal.